Norsworthy, and today I'm going to tell you the story of how a book club became transformative SEL. And this is the story of really lessons I've learned from a remote class of 1st through 8th graders. I'll start with a quote, bell hooks. "The heart of justice is truth-telling, seeing ourselves and the world the way it is rather than the way we want it to be. More than ever before, we, as a society, need to renew a commitment to truth-telling." So truth-telling, that includes who we are, where we come from, truth-telling to ourselves so that we have deep understandings of our culture and our beliefs, because we know that our beliefs influence what we notice. What we notice influences how we act. So this is a little bit about me. These are some of the people who are in my life, my children. These are some of the places that I can see outside of my window. These are some books that have been written by members of my family. This gives you a little bit of a sense of who I am, and therefore where some of my beliefs may rest. This story is going to be told in several parts. These are the intentions for this session. I'm going to begin with some gratitude, inspirations, and acknowledgement. Moving on to the reflection, sort of the piece that I was left with, and then the setting and the story that came to that, and some truths that I learned along the way. A word first, however, on this word intentions. One of the first things I had to shift when I began teaching this class of 1st through 8th graders was the intention, the plan to meet exacting standards. In a class through 1st through 8th graders, it is impossible to teach to exacting grade level standards. And so I needed to move towards what my intentions were as I looked at what the through lines are between 1st and 8th grade, and recognizing that my intentions may well be in tension with traditional expectations, but that teaching and learning are organic practices and they are not predictable. The work and the thinking that I am sharing with you today, I have such gratitude for the inspiration and so many acknowledgments that I could make and I have in my head of the people who have contributed to this thinking, students, families, and colleagues that I've had the pleasure to teach and learn with, both face-to-face and in remotely, face-to-face in person as well as face-to-face remotely. And also potentially this work has been informed by you in conversations that we may have engaged with in ongoing professional learning, conferences, institutes, Twitter chats, in books and texts of all types. My thinking is absolutely impacted by the wisdom, knowledge, and scholarship and experiences that have been imparted to me by others. And so I have attributed where I could. If an idea presented is one you'd like more information on and there is not an attribution, please reach out and I will try to match you up with the source. And also, if an idea that you believe is yours is not attributed, please do let me know, because I want to rectify that and make sure that in the future you receive your just attribution. This is together work, colleagues, and attributions matter. So I'm going to begin with a reflection, what I'm left with, what I see, and then go back to the setting, the story, and the truth. So this framework is an attempt to understand sort of what I learned from this book club visually and why I think this story is an important one to tell. The background thinking here is that we must be attuned and aware to what is happening in our learning spaces, that predictable routines allow for our brains to be filled up, to think about the thinking rather than how the thinking will unfold, Multiple modalities show various ways of communicating our thinking. And then really the content or our stories are where we hold new knowledge of ourselves, our emotions, right, in the world. If predictable routines are something you're interested in exploring further, I cannot recommend enough the resource that Harvard has created, the Project Zero work. These routines, or as I consider them now, really pathways, really do allow for the focus to be on the thinking rather than how the thinking will be communicated when these routines are implemented in a repetitive way. The goal with these routines or these pathways, as I have used them, is not to use as many as possible, but actually to use as few as possible so that students can have that pathway be expected and they can notice what happens right along it. Multiple modalities, right? So we sort our thinking, we sift our thinking, we create art, we write, we create music and rhythm. And the number one, I think I feel comfortable saying the number one modality, right, is the thing that we can do and accept of our students is their language, right? We have to embrace the language that our students bring. So you'll see the slide at the end without these additional graphics overlaid onto it. But really, this is a story of book love and community connection. And this is how we will be moving this work forward in the future. The background, that attuned and aware piece, is grounded in transformative SEL, the work of identity, agency, belonging, collaborative problem solving, and curiosity. The pathways or the routine that I lean into in this work is notice and wonder. Modalities are, of course, language, welcoming the language that students bring, as well as Zoom and Google Meets and Jamboard. And the contents are the text, in this case, the books that we shared, our thoughts and our feelings. So truly the reflection that I'm left with is that books like water have the power to shift us, bind us, and sustain us. The ways in which this happens, as I think in sort of what is the background that allowed this story to unfold, is the work of Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop, Uma Krishnaswamy, and I've layered some of my own thinking onto their thinking. So really thinking about how doors provide opportunities, right, for us to act. And that action has been informed by what we've seen through windows, what we've noticed, right, in our mirrors. And that once we have gone through these doors, we need places of shelter to be able to feel safe, right? Exploring our noticings and our wonderings before we choose to enter through those doors and act again. And knowing that as light knowledge shifts, that these prisms, they make light and new patterns and new noticings take place. And sometimes those are subtle, and sometimes they are bold. So thinking about the setting, right, reflection left me with that understanding of ways in which books have that power to transform us, to bind us, and to sustain us, and what were the things that needed to be in place for this work to develop. And so the first is a very clear anti-racist stance. And my anti-racist stance really began to be informed when shared with me was the work of Tima Okun, and that was presented initially through coconet.org. And so it's the way, right, that white supremacy, white dominant culture shows up in organizations. And I think that it is clear, right, that these are things that also show up in our schools. So whether that is perfectionism, binary either or thinking, right, the way in which we share the power of teaching and learning, the right to be able to be comfortable, right, in our spaces. The idea of individualism being more limiting than collectivism, which leads to an expansive understanding as we make collective meaning. And really, I'm thinking particularly about quality and a slowness of our work, so that we can really sort of I want to say that we want to sort of bathe, right, in our work and in the emotions and in what comes up for us when we wrestle with complex ideas and thoughts in classrooms and with colleagues. Right. And so CASEL, the Collaborative for Academic and Social Emotional Learning, has identified 5 competencies, which are self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision making. Dina Simmons has an article that asks us to consider the ways in which, done incorrectly, SEL is really white supremacy with a hug, right? When we put all of these competencies through a cultural lens, we are very likely to fall into patterns that center perfectionism, that center individualism, that center quantity over quality, that manufacture a sense of urgency. And so we can instead, as scholars at CASEL are sharing with us, think about self-awareness as identity work, self-management as agency work, social awareness as belonging, relationship skills as collaborative problem solving, and responsible decision making as curiosity. And that one in particular struck me because to truly think about responsible decision making, you have to think about who you are being responsible to, and therefore who you may be being irresponsible to, right? And curiosity allows us to think about the what ifs. And there has been research around curiosity that tells us that there are 2 different types of curiosity. And when we engage in them, different emotions come up in our brain. And we've seen this through functional MRIs. Curiosity can lead to uncomfortable feelings, and curiosity can lead to feelings of happiness, anticipation, excitement. And when that happens, right, dopamine is the reward. So that feel good chemical that floods our brain. And these 2 kinds of curiosity often work in synergy in the classroom, of course, right? Something new happens. It is surprising. It may be unexpected, or a new idea is shared. And that puts students, and it can put us as well, right, in an uncomfortable state of adversity. And then the positive curiosity kicks in when we have the tools, the skills, and the pathways to really think about new knowledge and to have the excitement, anticipation of that sort of joy and wonder and awe that new knowledge brings to us. And so one of the key features of awe, which also, right, can have 2 takes. There's that fear-based awe, and then there is that wonderment and that amazed awe. And that positive awe creates what we can think of as a small self, that sort of healthy proportion between ourselves and the bigger picture of the world around us. As Dr. Virginia Sturm shared, after engaging in work at University of California at San Francisco. And this work around awe was particularly important in the remote context. In the second full year of remote learning, it was very important that students began, and that I as well, right? I say students, but really when I say students, I think I mean myself in almost every sense of it, because aren't we all sort of students of the world and students of our thoughts? And so thinking about this concept of awe and creating that healthy proportion of where we begin and end, what's ours and what's the world's, and that there is a big and amazing and engaging and awe-filled magical world out there, and that we needed to maintain that awareness even as these students were in their second full year of remote learning and really not leaving their houses very much. This research from UCSF was done thinking about awe walks. They asked a group of adults, I think it was about 52 adults, to go out and to take awe walks, to immerse themselves in nature, or if they were in cities, to go to, I think they offered the opportunity to go to monuments and parks. And I'll link this video, this clip underneath this posting, so you're able to watch this short clip on your own. But really what they did was they gave the awe walkers and the control group selfie cameras to take selfies. And what they noticed over time is that as the awe walkers spent time in nature, the amount of space their own faces took up in the picture were reduced more and more so that the space, the bigness of the world was what showed up. And they noticed their smiles got bigger, and also sort of their sense of self visibly shrunk in proportion to the vastness of the world. And with it, there are health impacts that come with having that sense of self, that healthy sense of self. And so we know that awe is important, that it is an emotion that we don't talk a lot about. And so some of the ways that we can help children develop awe is by spending time in nature, listening to and engaging with music and art, rituals and community experiences, and wrestling with big ideas. And so by noticing and naming our systems and our connections, when we wander in our thoughts, we can generate that positive state of awe, which brings with it good feelings. And so it was important to me that we think about curiosity, that that curiosity can generate awe, and that we fostered book love in our remote space. Curiosity and book love. These are the things that I believe matter in education. And as the ladder of inference, a model by Chris Argyris, this is a graphic from actually Wikipedia, and it's Creative Commons licensed. This graphic really explains how our observations, right? Everything exists in the world. What we choose to observe, what we choose to notice comes from our beliefs. And when we choose, right, different things to notice, they reinforce our assumptions, and then we, right, draw those conclusions. They further inform our beliefs, and then that impacts our actions, right? So if what we believe or believe to be important influences what we notice, I have to just simply name that I believe curiosity and book love are important. And so I spent time noticing where those were showing up, and particularly noticing if they were at all. And so the idea was to kind of snowball it, right? That you start with what's happening and you work to create more conditions where that continues. So what were some of the conditions that that my observations, right, and assumptions and beliefs, what are some of the conditions that I believe must be present for book love? And I began with choice, right? Wide variety of choice in texts. And I leaned in on so much of the work of our colleagues and literacy thought leaders to help me identify these texts and the ways in which to talk and share about them. And I will share some of those resources at the end of this presentation. Next up, what was necessary to consider was what was truly needed, right, to enjoy and to embrace the choice that happened when we had a wide variety of texts. And as we know, reading books we love doesn't only depend on having lots of books to choose from. That's like saying that racial equity and literacy is accomplished by purchasing racially diverse books for school libraries and classrooms. Just as representation is only the beginning, a wide selection of texts is the same. It's only the very beginning. And for clarity, when I talk about text, it is in the most expansive sense. A broad understanding of the meaning of a text expands to include much more than narrative and nonfiction books, short stories, and poems. And so when we think about this broad selection of texts, right, and how we are going to have choice in those texts, it's not just about having the text. We have to learn how to abandon them and to say, no, this isn't for me. And what's really important is that when we say, no, this isn't for me, that we begin to develop the understanding of why that is the case, right? Why isn't it for me? And we have to be able to abandon books, right? So we increase our chance of finding true book love by being able to explain why some books aren't for us. And, right, the spoiler here is that it's not just book levels, right? Saying it's not the right level is simply not enough. It doesn't give the reader or the partner with the reader and helping them find this love, it doesn't give them enough information to make an informed choice. So we have to get really clear why some books are for us and why some books simply aren't. And this brings us to the beginning of the story, which is really acknowledging that having feelings is part of learning. And we spent time on this in our remote classroom of first through eighth graders, right? We talked about feelings and that how feelings can happen in really two ways. They can happen in our hearts, our emotions, and they happen in our bodies and our senses. And our brains process all of our feelings and they try to make sense of it. And then our brains have us act on the sense that we make. And our actions have impact. And so then, right, we have more feelings because we have feelings about the actions in our bodies and in our hearts. And there's six categories of these emotions we learned: happiness, fear, sadness, disgust, anger, and surprise. But like colors, our emotions mix. They have shades. And so the setting of the story included the need to really think about the ways that we talked about our feelings and developing the vocabulary and the understanding of the nuance of these emotions. And this work began actually with a STEAM project. We built some slime circuits using the STEAM Kiwi crates that we had for our classroom space. Every student had their own, and we worked together to build them. And as we built them, we reflected regularly on the feelings we held as we learned. And we noticed, right, that our bodies picked up senses. We saw and heard and felt things on our skin. We smelled or taste things. When that ooey gooey, I say ooey gooey, when that ooey gooey slime, right, was touched, some students were absolutely in like almost ecstasy as they were like stretching it and smelling it and rubbing it between their hands. Other students were like, oh my goodness, that ooey gooey slime. I'm somewhere in the middle. It depends on the slime, I think. So our body, right, picks up information from our senses, and that leads to our emotions. And so we noticed that these shifted regularly in our learning. And this was pretty low stakes. We simply observed what happened to us while we were learning, while we were going through the active process of collecting materials, right? What did we sense and what emotions popped up when we collected materials and measured ingredients, when we touched the slime, when we put wires into the slime and saw what happened? What did we notice, right, when we waited for the light to turn on and when it did? What did we notice at the end of our project? How did we feel? How did we feel about what we learned? And how did we feel about how we learned it? Was this a project that we'd want to engage in something similarly? What could I learn as an educator from my students' experiences that would allow me to be responsive, emotionally responsive to who they are as learners? So I had to ask, right? What is the impact this learning's had on you? What do you think you're going to do with it? What actions might you take? And here I'm thinking particularly about the work of Sarah Ahmed in that What is My News? And that work has greatly, right, informed this thinking that it's very important that we acknowledge for students what is in their power, developing that sense of agency. And what are the emotions that come up from, right, the actions that you might take? If you want more, how are you going to get it? Do you have to find money for that? Do you have to take the vulnerability of asking somebody? What might come up when you try to do this, potentially on your own or with another person? And so we talked about all of these things. And so we developed vocabulary for our feelings. We developed the importance of having somatic, right, body awareness of how our feelings manifest in our bodies so that we were able to be attuned and aware of them. We developed the language and also the skills through drawing and through sharing of images to be able to share our feelings in words and in other multiple modality ways, right, through art and through music, through color. And so how does this relate to literacy? Well, one of the things that began to surface was that we needed to have social experiences with books, that our own curiosity and our own awe in the experiences that we were having in our remote context were layered, but that they could be more deeply layered. We could plunge deeper. We needed authentic social experiences, especially because as the year went on, with much gratitude to the science of vaccines, many students returned to school and our class size shrunk. And with it, the varied experiences, right, that we had to contribute to our understanding of the same text shrunk as well. And so we needed to find thought partners who could bring their layered experiences, right, to consideration of the same text that we had so that we could have that awe and curiosity to really dive in and make meaning. We needed authentic social experiences. And so fortunately, the year before, when we had read Stamped for Kids by Dr. Sonia Cherry Paul as a class, students requested a set of it, and I put a call out and was given a class set of these books, which I dropped off at each student's house. And the group that funded this project wanted to create an ongoing relationship with a classroom. These were donors who came together in their work at a local hospital, in the research department. They were part of a book club, and they wanted to have an extended relationship with the classroom. And as they were particularly interested in thinking about anti-racism and inclusion in their own lives, they were interested in supporting that work in classrooms. And so in the fall of 21, as this remote context of first through eighth graders became a reality about 2 weeks before school, we met and we did some planning on what we might intend to create as an experience for both the adults and students. And I brought the recent research on the impact and importance of curiosity and awe, some ideas for books. And as a group, we came together with some intentions, which I'm calling in this slide purpose, right? So we planned a book love partnership with several goals. Our purpose was to come together to share book love. We would connect with our community. We would consider similarities and differences in our perspectives, building comprehension, building awe, building curiosity. We'd converse with new people, building language, and expanding our knowledge of careers in science and medicine, research among our students. And we would link to the content theme that we were really following through the year, because as we were thinking about connections, we were really focused on water and our planet. And so we wanted to read books which inspired connection between us and the earth on which we live. And our biggest goal was really to inspire awe in nature and science and the diversity of experience that we brought to the same space. And so we did, building off the Harvard Project Zero thinking routine of notice and wonder. We decided to focus on creators and books and would notice and wonder about images, words, ideas, and connections. And we would see what developed. So these are some of the creators who guided us. So Jayshree Patel, Hudson Talbot, Alexandra McClellan, Juana Martinez Neal, Liz Zunan, and William Kamkwamba. You likely notice that when you look at the pictures of these creators, right, we see diversity of what looks like gender expression, right? We see racial diversity. We can potentially assume cultural diversity. We knew from our deep dive into these creators that they represented geographic diversity, right? We can see some age diversity. And so we talked about who these creators were and what maybe compelled them to spend the time creating the texts that we plunged into. Because we knew as readers and writers ourselves in our class that creating text is no small feat. And so to develop, right, the ability to stick with the creation of a text, to be compelled to create, right, there has to be some reasons behind that. And we can spend some time in awe and wonderment as to the maybe whys. We don't need to have concrete, solid answers, but we can have our wonderings. The first book we read in our group was Hudson Talbot's A Walk in the Words. a book about a boy whose refuge was in art and who worked through the tangle of words. And this is a story that Hudson Talbot has modeled off of his own life. And the end papers of this book that tell us about Hudson Talbot gave us some insight into what compelled him to create this text, which we shared. And we also shared this as a sort of a gateway to the path of talking about our reading identities and our reading lives, and how as adults, even though potentially these students saw us as readers who perhaps came to be that by osmosis, participants shared the stories of their reading life development and the reading lives of their families. And sometimes they shared these books with their families, whether over Zoom across the country, whether in person. They shared the experiences of reading these books with the class and normalizing the diversity, again, of our reading lives. We read One Drop, Endless Ripples, which is a story of sort of the personification of a drop of water and the journey that one drop takes across the country of New Zealand. We read Zonia's Rainforest. And with this book, we particularly centered the difference in that fear-based awe and the joy of Zonia's engagement and awareness of what's happening around her in the rainforest. And students picked up on the brilliance of the Indigenous knowledge that was incorporated into this story. We also read as our final text, The Boy Who Harnessed the Wind, which really, at its heart, one interpretation of this book is that it is a story of noticing, of thinking, of wondering, and of acting. And in concert, right, with our needs, that identity, the needs of the people and planet, that sense of belonging. This book is full of curiosity. And really, this book is an example of the transformation that happens when we spend time noticing, thinking, wondering, and acting. So we use Jamboard to capture our thoughts and ideas. And why Jamboard? Well, Jamboard allows students to work collectively with multiple modalities. It's easy to jump in and scribe if that's what's called for, but students can contribute to Jamboards by circling things, by importing images, screenshots, by drawing. There's so many tools. So it really allows for a canvas to be created as an artifact of collective thinking around a text. And this was important because as students would read and explore books for pleasure, right, accessing the books as the adults did with siblings, with friends, with me, and often in more than one of those ways, they would things would bubble up for them that they wanted to choose to talk about with our book club. And so the adults engaging in the book club delved into author pages and enriched their understanding of the context the books came from. And as we did this as students, as a class, we also captured our thoughts. And every participant in this club was given a copy of the book to keep, to have, and to hold. So when we came together, after saying hello, we would begin. And we would simply begin with that, what did you notice that captured your attention? And what would you like to talk about? What did you wonder? What questions popped up? And over time, students would not only talk about what captured their attention, but why they thought that was the case. What about their identities and their curiosities, right, allowed them to notice that detail? Because we quickly noticed that when you have diversities of people, you have diversities of the observations that they make. And so for 45 minutes, we had conversation, open conversation, as students and adults shared thoughts, feelings, and questions. We learned about each other and our world. Each member shared at some point how they felt included and how much this time and the relationships mattered, that contributing mattered. Cameras were on. Sometimes art, pets, artifacts were shown. Sometimes I shared parts of the Jamboard screen in our group if students asked to show their thinking. Students shared thoughts and phrases in English as well as the language they spoke at home. As I mentioned before, translanguaging was honored throughout our year. After all, how can we welcome students in their wholeness and not welcome their language, their art, their energy, their artifacts, right? And so some of the work that emerged. One of the things that was quickly evident for me, for teacher me, was how rich these Jamboards of collective thought were for formative assessment. It was easy to see where the approximations, right, where misconceptions were. And I learned so much about the identities of my students by noticing what it was that they observed and what mattered to them. And this is a slide where that brilliance of the indigenous culture in Zonia's rainforest was shared, as students noticed that there was a house made with sticks that could keep you cool in the summer and warm in the winter, and how really that was a level of technology that we don't have in our New England city. And so, we talked about that, that it's not simply what we think of as digitally, technologically, digitally advanced peoples that hold knowledge, that deep knowledge is held by Indigenous people, and that conversation elicited lots of further learning and reading and conversations. That one alone, you can imagine, right? Students shared learning that they had done, that they transferred from class into this communication. They mentioned places where they saw alliteration and metaphors, using the strategy of finding a word and doing an image Google search instead of a word Google search, to really have a sense of what that word is trying to evoke. In this case, you can see in the lower corner, it was the word amphitheater, which Jayshree Patel had used to describe a bend in the river and what was found as an amphitheater. And we understood a bit about what that might have been like, perhaps the echo, the coziness of that space, the bounds of it, the perhaps the secret that's held from view from outside. Right. This slide shows some of the thinking that came up when a question was asked about the meaning of that AQUATIC word, which was, of course, aquatic. And so we connected that to aquarium. We got to colors, and then we got to closely looking at all the different aquas, all the different blue greens that were used to create this text. At the same time, these books, you'll see here, The Boy That Harnessed the Wind being one of them, crept into our class time. One of the tools that we used to elicit understanding of each other and our learning were open sorts, with pictures of book covers in a Jamboard. And so here you can see how the sort was presented with different texts that I could imagine, right, how I might connect them. But I will share with you one of the most impactful sorts was the student who sorted into books they had remembered and books they had not. And so we talked about sometimes we read things and we don't remember. And so we read them again. And I will share, which will not surprise any of you, right, that many students who did remember it wanted to be present for the rereadings, because really what a joyful practice it is to revisit beloved books. So as our time together progressed, we added a couple of sessions because to really make points about what you notice in Zonia's rainforest, you might have to explain how this thinking really began in one drop. These books webbed together, and our knowledge of each other did too. Right? Adult participants shared bits of their lives. As students shared more and more bits of their identities and cultures, their languages, as I had mentioned, their art, their passions, and themselves. I think that potentially one of the most impactful parts of these conversations, again, was the adults sharing about their reading lives and the importance of choice and of saying no to some books, and how reading really is a practice of consent to engage with the text and make meaning, and that we must empower students and ourselves to be able to say, no, this isn't for me. It is a life skill which will socially and emotionally sustain us. Actual awe was experienced. A particularly powerful example was when we talked about what we had learned as I was asked the question of what continent is New Zealand on? And Now, I don't know everything. I know, I know, I know that, and I'm sure you all know that none of us do, right? And that's a normal thing. And so, thankfully, we have things like Google and other resources. And so, our quick Google search online told us about the discovery of an eighth continent, and students were excited to share that learning with the adults who were really just stunned. You could see the awe and wonder and amazement on their faces. And students asked them what they were feeling and why and how. And you can see on this slide also a student found that while I was looking up the continent picture and others were, we found that Lucky Charms are banned in New Zealand for having unhealthy red dye number 40. That elicited a whole chain of reading and research and further conversations. This was such a generative experience. And then with the end of the year, our book club ended, and we had talked about the power of water, and the students had lifted all the powers, right, that water holds, and that water holds, right, the power to change rocks into sand, and it can cause choking. And so water can kill us, but we're also made of water and we need water. And then I remember, I think it was our student who was in theory classified, right, as a first grader, that water changes our feelings in different ways. And students talked about ways in which water made us calm or anxious. And we realized the power of books and the power of water, again, to bind us, to sustain us, to connect us, are so similar. And so as adults, we really thought about what had been brought to us socially and emotionally that was so supportive of our own existence, and the importance of continuing to nourish this idea, the privilege of coming together in a multi-generational way to be humans in all of this power of book love, to connect and enrich and inspire all in us. Right? And so that itself was a truth. We knew we needed to continue. We knew that it was clear, right, that talking about the importance of books and loving books is not nearly as impactful as the implementation of doing that in an authentic, multi-generational sense, without the orchestration of assuming predictable connections that students will make. Zaretta Hammond talks about how a tenet, right, of culturally responsive teaching is that we implement and we notice what happens when we implement. This requires that we are mindful of the differentiations that evolve. And in this particular context of a first through eighth grade classroom, it was different in that there really was mindful differentiation. I knew going in that there was no way that I could teach to the exacting grade level standards of first through eighth grades. And so doing so would have taken us apart as a class, and connection was important, and an expansive sense of what matters. And so we really approached teaching in a way that honored the identities of our students, mindful that differentiating was the most important thing. And it's something I'm not sure that we talk enough about. We talk a lot about grade level standards. And when we talk about differentiation and the need to do so, it's often talked about something that we wrestle with and is seen, and I've heard it framed in a problematic context, versus when you have a class of first through eighth graders, it's just a thing. We have to mindfully differentiate. We have to embrace multiple reasons, right, for saying, no, this text isn't for me, right? And this is so important because the reasons why this text might not be for you can range from what you still want to learn and need to learn about culture, about history, about geography, right, about science. And for those of you who have been waiting for where the phonics and the phonemic awareness comes into place here, when you love a book, you become invested in knowing it. And that means knowing its words too. We focused on phonemic awareness and phonics, explicit instruction of letters, sounds, word parts, and meanings, because we were invested in knowing these texts. So together we created a space where there was an expectation of book love, an expectation of the need to sometimes abandon books, and to be curious about why one does either, to develop a sense of awe. And this was transformative social emotional learning, while we harness the power of positive awe by practicing noticing, thinking, and wondering. So the project goes forward. This is the slide if you're interested in building off of it. Please find me on Twitter, with deep appreciation for your time, always in love and curiosity. The images on these slides are my own. If you'd like to use any of them, please reach out. And I appreciate the time you've taken to listen to my story, our story.